Okay, I did a video recently on the worst ways to increase milk supply, which was really fun. And I got a comment on it though that I thought was really interesting. This user laid out a story that I got a lot of replies on. So apparently this is happening to a lot of people. There were a lot of comments that said, I'm going through the exact same situation right now, or exact same thing happened to me, or how did you gain your supply back? I'm having the same issue now, or I was told the same thing, something like that. So I thought this might be a good one to talk about and explore because there were several points in it that I think we can discuss and figure out. Okay, so here was the comment on the video. I'm just going to start by reading it so we have the context to talk about it here. She said, interesting video. I started off with great milk supply when I had my son, lots of nursing and pumping, and I had more than enough for my son. One of the hospital lactation consultants called to check in on me a few weeks later, which was very sweet. She told me that I was making too much milk for just one baby and that I needed to take away a couple of sessions and shorten my pumping time. I listened and stepped back a bit, but my milk very quickly plummeted, and soon I didn't have enough milk. I went back to the way I started, and luckily it came back. I definitely like to have an oversupply rather than to have the exact right supply and risk having an undersupply. I was much more confident and happy about feeding my son with the oversupply and way more stressed out when I dropped a couple pumping sessions per day and ended up in short supply. Might not be the same for everyone, but that was just my experience. And okay, there's the scenario. A lot of different things to touch on there. So let's just start at the top, all right? I think it can be hard when someone comes to me saying a lactation consultant told me this and it did not work or it did not go well or whatever. It's hard for me as a lactation consultant because I've seen patients before and I know how tricky and challenging it is. Sometimes what a lactation consultant says is not the same as what a patient hears. So anytime I get like secondhand information, so what my LC said, I have to kind of take it with a grain of salt because it might be what you heard or what you understood or they said. Now, that's not to say that there are some lactation consultants that give bad advice. That happens. But also lactation consultants are humans and sometimes they have bad days and unfortunately that happens, right? So no one's perfect, is I guess what I'm trying to say here. But regardless, I think it also highlights a really important point is that lactation consultants, and myself included, I'm an IBCLC, we are really trained in feeding at the breast support, biological breastfeeding. And lactation consultants get little to none training in pumping. And I have a course, like a 12-hour course, training professionals on pumping because I specialize in pumping and that's what I do, but they get no formal training here. So when you see an oversupply, when we're talking about the biological norm of feeding baby at the breast, that is a problem. It causes problems for babies feeding at the breast. We do see this more often now because we have breast pumps and it can be easier to induce an oversupply where before we're just dealing with kind of natural oversupplies or, oversupplies that just happen that were more hormonal based, things like that. Now we're dealing with created oversupplies as well. And I think this is an area where a lot of professionals are uncomfortable because I know, and I guess maybe this is the second point I wanted to cover here, but I know it can seem like an oversupply is a great idea. And I'm not saying it's not. For this mom, it worked and it was what she wanted and it helped her meet her goals. I love that for her. But an oversupply is not rainbows and unicorns, right? It comes with its own problems, especially if you are mostly feeding at the breast. Now, I work with working moms and I coach them through the first year back to work, maintaining a milk supply long-term for that whole first year, using a pump, doing that. So the women that I work with, we often have a little bit of an oversupply, or that can even be the goal because part of your milk supply is being managed with a breast pump really intentionally. Does that make sense? And so sometimes it makes sense because you're already going to be pumping. This is going to be part of your story. So it's fine. You know what I mean? Especially if your body can handle it safely. The problem comes when you are mostly feeding at the breast and are inducing an oversupply with a breast pump kind of just because. And this user actually said something that I hear a lot, and it's not my favorite reason for trying to have an oversupply. Okay. She said something like, I really wanted an oversupply because I was so afraid of having a low supply, right? And that's not again, no judgment here, but I don't like it when we're doing something because of fear of something else. And I think low supply is talked about so much in the media. And even on my channel, there's a lot of videos on, how to not have low supply. This video was like the worst ways to increase milk supply. Like, we're talking to low supply problems here. So I get that it's a problem that's talked about and we're knowing more about, but we can also see it more because we're pumping more. It's an interesting phenomenon because when you're mostly feeding at the breast, you can't really see what's happening. We're forced to trust biology a little bit more by monitoring the baby's mannerisms, right? Are they full? Are they relaxed after feedings? Are they gaining weight well? Do they have, wet and dirty diapers each day? Do things seem to be going fine? But when we add in a breast pump, now we have numbers and we have data, and that can be a tricky thing because now we can see things. Another hard point is a breast pump is not a baby, right? So just because we put a pump on and we push play, that's not an accurate picture of our milk supply. There's actually one of my favorite videos that I've ever done, popular too, which I'm glad because it's a really good topic, is called Low Milk Supply versus Low Pumping Output. Because these things are not always the same either. Just because you're getting low output with the pump doesn't necessarily mean you have low supply. It could be a pumping problem, right? Obviously, if you have low supply, you're going to get low output, but it doesn't always mean that. And from a lot of the women that I work with, oftentimes it's a pumping problem. Something about pumping is not correct, and we're not getting all the milk out that's already there. So oversupply, I see why you want it, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In fact, what I wish would have happened with this mother would have been to have a conversation and say, okay, I see where you're at and what you're doing. Tell me a little bit more about your long-term goals and what you're looking for. Tell me about your mental health at the moment. How are you feeling about things? Do you have, plans to return to work? Do you have plans to go on vacation? Or do you leave your baby often? Do you have plans for another child coming up soon? There are a lot of reasons that we would need some extra milk to meet a goal that a particular mom has. And so for me, that's what I would have asked in this situation is, tell me about your long-term goals. What are you trying to do? If I discover that the only reason you're adding pumping to breastfeeding or that you're creating this oversupply on purpose is because you're afraid of low supply, that's where I think a conversation like this might need to happen. But it can't just be you're making too much milk, you need to start pumping less, because that's not a good plan either. Because like this mom experienced, and several of these other people that are commenting here, without a plan or without some focused help in doing that, you're just gonna send stuff the other way, right? Your body is based on supply and demand for milk supply. So we can't just pump less or express less. You're gonna make less, which again is the point, but it needs to be intentional and hopefully with the guidance of a professional there, unless you are really comfortable and know what you're doing. So a lot of interesting points to talk about in this comment. And it was interesting to me that so many other people said that they were in a similar situation. And that's unfortunate. I'm not here to say I'm pro or con oversupply. I think it really depends on the individual mother and why we're doing that and what their goals are. Another point I wanted to bring up is that early milk supply can often be quite large before it regulates out and those post-birth hormones can get their act together and things settle in. So it can be really tricky. And I don't know how far postpartum this mom was when she was given this advice. But in the beginning, you can have an oversupply just kind of naturally because your body said, just had a baby, here's a bunch of milk. Tell me how much milk you want. And so it's waiting for signals from you and from the baby to say, how much milk do I want? So if you continue to remove milk really frequently and often, it's going to keep making that milk, and especially at a high speed, if you're removing it at a high speed. Does that make sense? Which in this case, it sounds like they were feeding at the breast and pumping, just was like milk being removed. So your body's like, oh man, we need a lot of milk. If you slow down, then your body's going to slow down too, right? But the tricky part is about 12 weeks ish. And again, I plan to do another video on this very soon, talking about this kind of milk supply regulation moment that tends to happen. If you're doing that further post-birth, it can be really hard to get back up. So I'm really glad that this mom was able to get it back to where she wanted it pretty quickly and easily, but that's not always the case. And the further away from birth you are, the harder that becomes usually, because supply becomes solely dependent on supply and demand. Another comment on her situation that struck me was this one. And she said, "What? I've never heard of way too much milk. It's better than low supply or just right. You know, for an emergency, for oversupply, you can stack up the freezer, etc. That's messed up." She said that, or even be donated. Hopefully everything goes back to normal. And I think this is another kind of mindset thing that is interesting to me, because I do really think we are so scared of low supply that oversupply seems like the goal. And it's just not, you're not designed to produce more milk than you need. So we can force it, but oversupply comes with its own challenges. And I'm not sure if I don't think I went into depth earlier in this video, but if you're exclusively breastfeeding the baby and you have an oversupply, it can be hard for them to breastfeed effectively. They can get a lot of milk right up front because there's so much milk there. We don't see this terribly often, so don't freak out, but we do sometimes see a foremilk hindmilk imbalance when we have a large oversupply, because they're getting a lot of foremilk and not a lot of the hindmilk because there's just so much milk there. You also run higher risks for clogged ducts and mastitis because you just have more milk. So it can be easy for milk stasis to happen, which is where milk ends up sitting longer because you constantly have to be removing the milk that you've created there, which also means you get no break. You always have to deal with this milk. If you're like, "Oh man, I have an oversupply, but this weekend's really busy, so I'm just gonna feed my baby and not deal with it," that kind of doesn't become an option. Now you're going to have to take your breast pump with you, unless you're super great at hand expression and can just do that. You're gonna have to deal with it, because if a large quantities of milk like that sit there, you're gonna get clogs, and those can get infected and lead to mastitis. So it's not like you don't get a break from this. Again, which is why I said that working moms tend to get away with this a little bit better, because pumping is already part of their lives consistently. Or if you're exclusively pumping, this becomes less of a problem too. Again, because pumping and removing milk, you can remove as much milk as you want, essentially. Like a baby can't eat more than their stomach can hold, right? And so then you have to deal with it another way. But if you're exclusively pumping, sometimes you can get away with this. And I've known lactation consultants or, pumping help that intentionally help people build oversupplies with pumping. And again, I'm not here to judge. It just depends on what the mother is looking for. But when you're exclusively pumping, it matters a little bit less because you are always just removing that milk anyway. But when you're combining breastfeeding, or if you're mostly breastfeeding, it can be difficult. So it's not always the goal. And I wish we could normalize being just enougher. Whenever I see that term, I like it because I'm like, hey, let's be a just enougher, but it often comes with a negative connotation, which I don't like. So I don't know. I guess that was my soapbox of, we don't need oversupplies, okay? We also don't want low supplies. I get it. And it seems like a really fine balance to meet in the middle. So a tendency towards an oversupply might be fine, but you just need to know what you're getting yourself into. And if you're okay with it and it helps support your long-term goals, that's great. But I don't think it should be the goal for everybody. So I don't even know. This video is a little bit less scripted than normal, but I did just want to kind of walk through that comment because it seems like so many of you are also experiencing this. If a healthcare provider of any kind, myself included, if you see something on my channel that doesn't sit right with you, or if you're like, that doesn't make sense from what I want, or, some advice goes badly, you can always get a second opinion somewhere, right? Everyone is human. No one's perfect. No one has all the answers here. So at the end of the day, you can trust your gut a little bit or find someone that you feel really comfortable with to work with to help you through this. So if you have any questions or if you have any other thoughts about any of that, let me know on this video and maybe we can dive through and talk about your comment or an experience that you've had there. But I hope this was helpful. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. We're always talking about pumping, working mom life, milk supply, all of that stuff, and I'd love to see you back here. Happy pumping.